The first time I realized Tom might leave me was when I found the receipts. Not just any receipts. Dinner for two at Marcello's, our anniversary spot in downtown Boston. Except our anniversary wasn't for another 3 months, and I certainly wasn't the second person at that table. Working late again? I'd asked the night before, my voice thin against the kitchen silence as I reheated his dinner for the third time that week. The Henderson account, he'd muttered, not meeting my eyes. Deadline tomorrow. The Henderson account. Always the Henderson account. I'd grown to hate the name as much as I hated the smell of his cologne mixed with something floral when he finally came home after midnight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand where we started to appreciate where we ended. 7 years ago, Tom Whitaker was the most promising investment banker at his firm, and I was a graphic designer with big dreams and a small studio apartment in Cambridge. We met at my best friend's wedding. He was the charming groomsman with the perfect smile, and I was the maid of honor who'd spent the previous night helping the bride through pre-wedding jitters. "You look like you could use this," he'd said, sliding a glass of champagne toward me after I'd finished my toast. His eyes were warm brown, crinkled at the corners when he smiled. That was beautiful, by the way, the toast. By the end of the night, I'd given him my number. By the end of the month, we were inseparable. And a year later, we were married in a modest ceremony on Cape Cod, the Atlantic stretching endlessly behind us as we exchanged vows. For richer, for poorer, I'd promised, meaning every word. I didn't know then how soon that vow would be tested. The market crashed 6 months after our honeymoon. Tom's firm downsized aggressively, and suddenly his corner office belonged to someone else. We moved from our downtown condo to a 2-bedroom in Somerville. I took on extra freelance projects. He interviewed endlessly. We were okay at first. Loving each other through hardship seemed to strengthen what we had. "I've got a lead," he'd say, week after week. "Something big is coming, Ellie. I can feel it." I believed him because I needed to. Because the alternative was admitting we were sinking. 2 years later, Tom's big break finally came, an opportunity to join a startup fintech company with enormous potential. The catch? He needed to invest, substantially. "It's everything we've been waiting for," he said, eyes bright with an intensity I hadn't seen since before the layoff. "But we need to put in $50,000 to secure my partnership position." $50,000, our entire savings, plus the inheritance my grandmother had left me. Money I'd been quietly setting aside for the design studio I dreamed of opening. "What if it doesn't work out?" I asked, my stomach tight with anxiety. "It will," he insisted. "In 18 months, we'll have tripled our investment. Minimum." I remember standing in our kitchen, sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the counter where all our financial documents were spread out. Everything we had, all the security we'd built, right there on paper. "Okay," I finally said. "Let's do it." I transferred everything the next day. My last dollars following his dream. I didn't regret it then. Marriage was partnership, and his success would be our success. For a while, it seemed like the right decision. Tom worked 16-hour days, came home excited, talking about user acquisition and venture capital meetings. The company grew, adding employees, moving to a larger office space. Tom started wearing his expensive watches again, bought a new car. But our bank account didn't reflect this apparent success. Each time I asked about distributions or when we might see returns, Tom had a sophisticated explanation about reinvestment and growth phases. "Just a little longer," became his mantra. "We're almost there." Then came the late nights, the mysterious weekend trips, the text messages he'd quickly delete when I entered the room. I wasn't naive, but I was invested, emotionally and financially. Walking away meant admitting I'd made a catastrophic mistake, that I'd gambled everything on the wrong person, so I stayed, pretending not to notice the perfume, the distant look in his eyes, the way he no longer reached for me in the dark. Until the night I found the receipt from Marcello's tucked in his jacket pocket, along with a handwritten note. "Last night was perfect. Can't wait for Paris. K. Paris." We'd always talked about going to Paris together. I waited up for him that night, the receipt and note on the kitchen table between us when he finally came home. "I can explain," he started, his voice steady, practiced. But his eyes gave him away, not guilt, but relief. He was glad to be caught, tired of the deception. "Don't," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Just tell me one thing. Is it serious?" He hesitated only briefly. "Yes." 7 years of love and sacrifice, reduced to a single syllable. "Her name is Catherine," he continued, as if I'd asked. "She's an angel investor. She came on board 6 months ago." 6 months. While I'd been taking the bus to save money for our future, pinching pennies to reinvest in his dream, he'd been building a new life with someone else. "And our money?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The company's doing well," he said carefully, "but it's all tied up in equity. I can't liquidate my position right now." "Can't or won't?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I slept in the spare bedroom that night, staring at the ceiling, mentally calculating what I had left, some personal savings, barely enough for first and last month's rent somewhere much smaller. In the morning, Tom was gone. A note on the counter explaining he was staying at a hotel for a few days, to give us space. Space. As if that was what I needed, I called in sick to my freelance job and spent the day in a daze, wandering from room to room in our apartment, touching the life we built. In the closet, I noticed his expensive suits were gone. In the bathroom, his toiletries had vanished. He'd been planning this exit for weeks. My phone rang that afternoon, a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Eleanor Whitaker?" a formal male voice asked. "Yes," I replied, wondering if Tom had already contacted a divorce attorney. "This is Richard Holloway from Pearson Davenport and Holloway. I represent the estate of Frederick Whitaker. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Frederick Whitaker, Tom's uncle, the eccentric relative who lived in a sprawling Victorian in western Massachusetts, who sent expensive but oddly impersonal Christmas gifts, who Tom had mentioned with a mixture of respect and distance." "There's been an accident," Richard Holloway explained, his voice measured and professional. "Mr. Whitaker passed away last week while hiking in the Berkshires. Heart attack, the doctors believe." I sank onto the couch, a strange numbness spreading through me. I'd only met Frederick twice, once at our wedding and once at a stiff, formal dinner at his home. He'd been polite but reserved, more interested in Tom's career than in getting to know me. "I'm very sorry," I said automatically, "but I'm not sure why you're calling me." "Shouldn't you be speaking with Tom?" There was a pause on the line. "We've been unable to reach Mr. Thomas Whitaker. His office said he's traveling. Paris," I thought bitterly. "He's flying to Paris with Catherine." "Mrs. Whitaker, the reason for my call is that you've been named as the primary beneficiary in Frederick's will." The words didn't register at first. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Frederick Whitaker has left the majority of his estate to you specifically. Not to Thomas, but to you, Eleanor Whitaker." My hands began to tremble. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Richard assured me. "The will was updated 8 months ago. Frederick was very specific. The house in Stockbridge, the investment portfolio, the art collection, all left directly to you. But why?" I managed to ask. Another pause. "Perhaps that's a conversation better had in person. Could you come to my office tomorrow? There are papers to sign and some context I believe you should have." I agreed, still in shock, and wrote down the address with a hand that didn't feel like my own. That night, I received a text from Tom. "We need to talk about next steps. I'll come by tomorrow afternoon to discuss separation arrangements." I didn't reply. The next morning, I drove to the law offices in downtown Boston, finding parking in an expensive garage I would normally have avoided. The firm occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming high-rise, all polished wood and hushed conversations. Richard Holloway was older than I'd expected, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He welcomed me into a conference room with a view of the harbor. "Mrs. Whitaker," he began, once we were settled with coffee. "Before we get to the formal reading, there's a letter Frederick wanted you to have." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name was written on the front in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. "I'll give you a moment," Richard said, stepping out of the room. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope. "Dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I've finally had the good sense to die. And you're probably quite confused about why I've left everything to a woman I barely knew. Allow me to explain. I've watched you for 7 years. Your loyalty to my nephew, your sacrifices, your quiet dignity in the face of his increasingly poor behavior. I see more than people realize. I always have. When Thomas came to me 6 months ago asking for a loan to expand his business, I had him investigated. What I discovered disappointed, but didn't surprise me. The company exists, yes, but his position is minor. The money you both invested, your money primarily, was largely squandered on creating an illusion of success while he pursued other interests, both professional and personal. I confronted him with what I knew. He was defensive, then angry, then pleading. I offered him a choice: come clean to you and make amends, or lose his inheritance. He chose neither, believing he could charm or deceive his way through, as he has his entire life, like his father before him. You deserved better, Eleanor. I've left you what Thomas might have had, not out of spite for him, but out of respect for you. The woman who kept her vows, the woman who gave her last dollar to support her husband's dreams, even as those dreams excluded her. The estate is substantial, approximately $27 million after taxes. Use it wisely, but also use some of it frivolously. Life is too short for constant prudence, as my recent medical diagnosis has reminded me. I've instructed Richard to assist you in any way he can. He's a good man and a better lawyer than I deserved. With respect and apologies for not knowing you better, Frederick Whitaker. I read the letter twice, tears blurring my vision by the second reading. $27 million. It was an incomprehensible sum, a life-changing amount that rewrote every calculation I'd been making about my future. When Richard returned, I was still staring at the letter. He knew, I said softly. About everything. Richard nodded. Frederick was more observant than most gave him credit for, and he valued loyalty above all else. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of paperwork and explanations. The Victorian house in the Berkshires, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks and bonds, art collections, even a small private island off the coast of Maine. All now mine. We can set up a meeting with the financial team next week, Richard said as we finished. In the meantime, this should help with immediate concerns. He handed me a check for $50,000, the exact amount I'd invested in Tom's venture. Frederick was very specific about that figure, Richard added, with the ghost of a smile. I left the law office in a daze, the check burning a hole in my purse, the reality of my new situation still not fully registered. I drove back to my apartment on autopilot, arriving just as Tom's new BMW pulled into the parking lot. He looked good, damn him. Tanned and rested in an expensive suit I'd never seen before. The sight of him brought back a wave of anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Ellie, he said, as we both reached the front door. Thanks for meeting me. This doesn't have to be difficult. I didn't answer, just unlocked the door and let us both in. The apartment felt different now, less like a site of betrayal and more like a temporary stopping point on the way to somewhere else. I've been thinking about how we handle this, Tom continued, setting his keys on the counter with familiar ease. I think we can avoid lawyers if we're reasonable. The apartment lease is in both our names, but I'm willing to let you stay through the end of the month while you find something more suitable to your situation. My situation. As if my reduced circumstances were a natural disaster rather than the direct result of his actions. And the money I invested? I asked quietly. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. Like I explained, it's tied up in equity. Once the company has its next funding round, maybe I can... You're lying, I interrupted, surprising us both. There is no equity, is there? At least not $50,000 worth. His expression hardened. What's that supposed to mean? Your uncle told me everything, Tom. A flash of something, fear, confusion, crossed his face. You talked to Uncle Frederick? When? His lawyer called me yesterday. Frederick died last week. Tom paled visibly, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs. Dead? But he was just... He trailed off, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. What do you mean he told you everything? I considered showing him the letter but decided against it. It wasn't for him. Instead, I placed the check from Richard on the table between us. "He left me money," I said simply. "Enough to replace what I invested in your company." Tom stared at the check, then back at me, his mind visibly racing. "He left you money? Not me?" "Not you." His face flushed with anger. "That's ridiculous. I'm his only living relative. There must be some mistake." "No mistake." I echoed Richard's words from yesterday. He was very specific. Tom stood up, pacing the kitchen. "How much?" he demanded. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters. It's family money. My family." I watched him, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. The entitlement, the calculation behind every expression. How had I missed it for so long? "Enough that I won't need to find something more suitable to my situation," I said. "Enough that I don't need to worry about the end of the month." He stared at me, reassessing. I could almost see the shift in his thinking, the recalibration of how to approach me now that I might not be destitute. "Ellie," he said, his voice softening. "This has all been a misunderstanding. Catherine is just... Don't." I cut him off. "We're past that now." "But we need to discuss..." "The divorce?" I supplied. "Yes, we do. I've already scheduled a meeting with an attorney. I'll have papers drawn up." His eyes narrowed. "You work fast." "I learned from the best," I replied, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "You should go now, Tom. Your hotel is waiting, and I imagine Catherine is too." He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression stopped him. For the first time since I'd known him, Thomas Whitaker was at a loss for words. After he left, I stood in the middle of the apartment, feeling lighter than I had in years. Tomorrow, I would call a real estate agent about the house in Stockbridge. Next week, I would meet with Frederick's financial team. And soon, I would look into commercial spaces for the design studio I'd always dreamed of opening. But tonight, I ordered expensive takeout, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, and raised a glass to Frederick Whitaker, the stranger who had seen me when I was invisible, even to myself. 6 months can change everything. The Victorian house in Stockbridge became my sanctuary. Set on 10 acres of woodland with views of the Berkshire Mountains, it was grand without being ostentatious, historic without feeling trapped in time. Frederick had modernized the interior while preserving its character. Wide plank floors, intricate moldings, bay windows that caught the morning light. I moved in a month after our meeting with Richard, bringing only what truly mattered from my old life. The rest I donated or sold, shedding the remnants of a marriage built on shifting sand. The divorce proceedings were remarkably straightforward, thanks to the prenuptial agreement Tom had insisted upon when we married. An irony not lost on me. The document designed to protect his assets from me now shielded my inheritance from him. Tom fought it, of course, filed motions claiming entitlement to Frederick's estate as blood relation, demanded financial records, even showed up at the Stockbridge house one afternoon, Catherine waiting in the car, to reason with me. "This isn't right, Ellie," he'd said, standing on the wraparound porch, looking smaller somehow against the backdrop of the estate. "You know Frederick meant for this to stay in the family." "It has," I replied simply. "I'm still a Whitaker, for now." His lawyers eventually conceded after Richard produced recordings of meetings between Frederick and Tom, documenting the ultimatum, and Tom's dismissal of it. I sometimes wondered if Tom regretted his choices when he realized what they had cost him, or if he only regretted being caught. It didn't matter. I was building something new. The first floor of a historic building in downtown Great Barrington became Whitaker Design Studio, spelled with the extra A intentionally, a small rebellion, a reclaiming. I hired 2 young designers fresh out of art school, invested in top-of-the-line equipment, and began reaching out to former clients. To my surprise, most remembered me fondly and were eager to work together again. Word spread. Local businesses needed rebranding. A tech startup from Boston wanted a complete identity package. A publishing house contracted us for cover designs. I worked harder than I ever had, but with a joy that had been missing for years. Each morning, I woke before dawn, watched the sun rise over the mountains with a cup of coffee on the porch, then drove the winding roads to the studio with the windows down, breathing in the scent of pine and possibility. In the evenings, I explored my new community, joined a book club at the local library, took cooking classes at a farm-to-table restaurant, attended gallery openings and chamber music concerts. Slowly, carefully, I built a life that was entirely my own. Frederick's financial team managed the investments with minimal input from me, sending monthly reports I gradually learned to understand. I established a scholarship fund at the regional high school for students interested in graphic design. Donated to the Conservation Trust preserving the woodlands around my new home. Found small ways to extend the unexpected generosity that had transformed my life. It wasn't all smooth. There were nights I woke at 3 a.m., heart racing, convinced it had all been a dream. Days when the responsibility of such wealth felt overwhelming. Moments when I missed the simplicity of my old life, even with its hidden fractures. Richard became an unexpected friend and advisor, stopping by the studio when business brought him to the Berkshires, offering guidance without condescension. It was during one such visit, almost exactly 6 months after Frederick's death, that he mentioned the journals. "I almost forgot," he said, as we finished lunch at a cafe near my studio. "There's a collection of Frederick's personal journals in the attic study. He mentioned wanting you to have them when you were ready." That evening, I climbed the narrow stairs to the third-floor study I'd only briefly explored. The room was distinctly Frederick's. Leather chairs worn soft with age, walls lined with bookshelves, a massive oak desk positioned to view the mountains through dormer windows. The journals occupied a full shelf, leather-bound volumes dating back decades. I selected the most recent one, settled into a chair by the window, and began to read. Frederick Whitaker revealed himself to be a keen observer of human nature, by turns cynical and surprisingly tender. He wrote about business dealings, travels to obscure corners of the world, books that challenged his thinking, and increasingly in later volumes about his family, particularly Tom. May 15th. Thomas visited today, ostensibly to discuss investment opportunities. The real purpose emerged after the second scotch. He needs money, claims to be building something revolutionary, but his eyes shift when pressed for details. So like his father, all charm and grand promises. I said I'd consider it, which he took as agreement. We'll have Marcus look into this venture before committing a cent. June 28th. Marcus's report on Thomas's company arrived. Worse than I expected. The business exists, but barely. Meanwhile, he's been maintaining an expensive facade. The car, the clothes, the trips, while his wife takes the bus to freelance jobs. Eleanor deserves better. I've always thought so, from the moment he brought her to that dinner years ago. She listened more than she spoke, observed everything, asked the one question about my Japanese maple that told me she was actually seeing her surroundings, not just calculating their worth. August thirst. Confronted Thomas today with what I know. Explosive reaction, followed by the usual manipulations. I offered a choice. Honesty with Eleanor or consequences. He believes there's always a third option involving charm and deception. The oncologist gave me 6 months yesterday. Not enough time to see if Thomas will finally grow up, but perhaps enough to ensure Eleanor isn't left with nothing when he inevitably leaves. I read until the light faded, then continued by lamplight, absorbing Frederick's private thoughts, understanding finally why this man I barely knew had changed the course of my life so dramatically. The last entry was dated just 3 days before his death. The papers are signed. Richard understands my wishes. The doctors suggest hospice, but I'll be damned if I spend my final days in a bed. The Berkshires are beautiful this time of year. If my heart is going to give out, I'd rather it happen on a mountain trail than surrounded by machines and pitying faces. I wonder if Eleanor will understand this gift for what it is, not charity, but recognition. The money means nothing to me now, but I take comfort knowing it will go to someone who values more than its material worth, someone who might use it to build rather than acquire. I regret not knowing her better. Perhaps she'll understand me through these pages when I'm gone. Thomas will be angry, of course, may even hate me for a time, but hatred passes, and perhaps someday he'll understand that this was not punishment but an attempt, my final one, to teach him about consequences. The sunrise from Prospect Hill is worth waking early for. I think I'll try to make it there tomorrow. I closed the journal, tears streaming silently down my face. Not for the money, not even for the validation of being seen and valued, but for the connection to this complicated man who had, in his final act, chosen to believe in me when I had stopped believing in myself. The next morning, I woke before dawn, drove to the trailhead for Prospect Hill, and hiked up in time to watch the sun rise over the valley. The world spread out before me, mountains and forests and small towns tucked into valleys, mist rising from the rivers, everything bathed in golden light. I thought about Frederick standing in this same spot, perhaps knowing it would be one of his last sunrises. I thought about Tom, wondering if he was happy with Catherine in Paris, or if he was already constructing the next version of himself for someone new. I thought about the winding path that had brought me here, through heartbreak and betrayal to this unexpected new beginning. As I descended the trail, my phone buzzed with a text from my senior designer. Client loved the concepts, meeting at 10 to finalize details. I smiled, quickening my pace. There was work to do, a business to build, a life to live fully, not despite what had happened, but because of it. The last dollar I gave to Tom had seemed like an ending. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything that mattered.